for more information and more complexity.
Yeah,
You know, something like that.
And sometimes it's slower, but it's always intentional now. It's not by accident. It's not as if they just cut it wrong, you know. Now it's like if they did a long slow shot, it's because they did something they wanted to see point in, and they did something for you to think about just before. Like it's just professionalized really well.
Yeah, there is a book called "Everything Bad Is Good for You" by a guy named Stephen Berlin Johnson, and this was also about a decade ago, and he was talking about some of the changes, you know, wrought by the internet era, and he was making. That's where I first read this whole idea, not just idea, but I think it's demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that these television scripts are more complicated. You're following multiple characters. You've got the primary protagonists and I guess sub-protagonists. I don't even think that's a term, but I'll put that out there. And you're following all of their stories now in much greater detail. So the idea that the internet was making us stupid, that modernity is making us stupid, is undermined, I think, at this sort of substrata, technical, general background condition way that is not really obvious to people because maybe they're just seeing more violence and sexualized stuff, which is more present than it used to be all around us. But it's hiding an actual greater intellectualization or even an IQ improvement. So I made a little some notes here. I was looking at your Twitter just before, as you can tell. Think here. Yeah, so Slate Star Codex. What did you think of that New Yorker piece about Slate Star?
I have mixed feelings. Like, it was really, they obviously kind of got it. Like, they'd read a lot of it. They read the articles.
Yeah, a little better than I expected. A little better than I expected, actually.
Much better than I expected. And they captured, I do see the culture they're trying to carve out. It is Silicon Valley plus rationalist. That's the same thing. And they do have a problem with media. That's a thing too. Yeah. And he weaved that together. It was a nice article. But it was, I didn't like it for other reasons. I didn't think it was very fair about, it was really dismissive about the worry that it was going to be a hit piece. Like, they were saying, it is ridiculous to think that the New York Times would go after some blogger. They're too good for that. And then later on in the article, it's like looking through some of the pieces and the topics they're talking about, like gender differences and stuff like that. Yeah. It's easy to see how they might write a bad article. And it was like, it just got massive dissonance between those two things because they're saying the opposite thing. I don't know what that meant.
Yeah. I can't deny that when I read stuff like that, I might be motivated to downplay some of the things that others might think of as egregious. I mean, so I don't know why that might say something about my temperament being actually in Silicon Valley, and so wanting to reduce conflict, being someone who works in tech but likes Scott Alexander. I want to sort of reduce conflict, and sometimes maybe it's so apparent that it should be highlighted and not swept under the rug, but. So, okay, one thing that comes to mind is the way that they mentioned that Steve Saylor was a commenter there sometimes, right? Right. I mean, so is Frederick DeBoer, and he's on the left. So they'll like name drop things in a way that sort of poisons the well,
Yeah.
When it's not like Steve Saylor is dominating the comments in any way at all. I mean, like, he's completely drowned out by so many others. But you had to go and mention that and not a left-winger who also frequents the site, right? So little things like that. I thought it was interesting that the way that the article seemed to stick up for Scott Alexander himself, but was trying to criticize the fans of Scott Alexander and some of the people who seemed to run with it, speaking up in defense of him. Who's that guy? Very difficult name to pronounce. Srinivas.
Yeah, Balaji. Can't say his last name. I'm not even going to try.
Yeah. Srinivas. Yeah. So he was shown to be kind of an antagonist in this whole saga.
Because he's going after them. He's had it. It's like how much like bullying do you take from journalists who are cynically taking you down for like 5 years or more now. How long do you put up with that and not fight back? It's like they're being immoral. They ought to be taken down a peg. And so I'm with Balaji all the way.
Yeah, because Scott really is on the he's got no fight in him, and that's why I guess it's not saying too much about the what is it, gregariousness, the niceness of this New Yorker writer to leave Scott out of it when Scott has been so he has stood down in the face of this, unless you want to read I'm deleting my blog because New York Times is going to out me as some kind of way of claiming that you're the victim, and so actually that post was a weapon in itself. You can think of these things on different layers, like on a kind of a superficial optics layer. That was a way of claiming victimhood, and that was a volley launched at New York Times. Like, they're making me shut down, they're making me shut up, they're making me stand down. Or you take a somewhat bigger picture and just see that they made you stand down, so you're not a problem anymore. They've neutralized you. So so in a piece written about Scott Alexander and the politics around that, we're going to leave Scott Alexander himself out of it because he stood down like we wanted him to. But these other people, we need to go after them. So you can be, maybe there's a fine line between credulousness and being adhering to the rules of the rationality community, and fine line between two things.
Yeah, he can put his blog post up at any time he wants. Like, my prediction is that will happen. I think the New Yorker, I don't see an article now that makes sense. It's been done. So I don't know what the New York Times would do as an article, since that was actually quite as good as the New York Times could do on it. So I see it just whimpering out, and I think Scott will just put back up Slate Star Codex.
Yeah, I think now that there is no piece coming from the New York Times.
Yeah.
Or at least by the time something that comes around that could plausibly thought of as the piece they were thinking about writing, it'll be so tenuously tied to Scott Alexander's blog and COVID, which was the alleged, genesis of the piece. Scott Alexander, something about coronavirus, we were going to get his opinion on that. Like, it'll be so tenuously tied to that you could just say, I don't think this was not even the piece anyone thought would come. So it's not the piece. I don't think it's even going to come at this point.
I actually would have liked to see more of that in the New Yorker piece. What was missing was how some of the mainstream journalists were mocking the Silicon Valley types because of their paranoia about COVID back in February, and how they got that really wrong, and how
yeah, that's true. That's right.
That's part of the story.
Do you remember Razib Khan? Do you know Razib Khan?
Yeah, I know Razib Khan.
He's actually in Texas now, but he went to UC Davis. He worked in UC Davis, and he's got Bay Area connections. He's involved in all that. And I recall him tweeting at the time that, at the time being, say February and March, that, these conferences that were being canceled, they were overdoing it, right? That he was talking about how the journalists were sort of criticizing Silicon Valley for overdoing this, this response to coronavirus by canceling conferences, blah, blah, blah. And now it seems in retrospect they weren't canceling enough of them, It's hard keeping track of who thought what at what time. But yeah, I do recall some of that.
You can go back. The one I'm thinking of is done by Recode, and they didn't even cancel the conference. It was no handshakes. It's just that. And I remember there was a New York Times piece about Australian politics, because we were considering Chinese travel bans, and they were saying that was xenophobic, and that's a much bigger worry, is the xenophobia, than the virus.
Yes, yeah. Australia seems in a similar position to California, not just climate-wise, but coastal California, at least. Coastal California and Australia seem to have, even if just implicitly, a lot of Chinese politics being wrapped up in these conversations,
Yep.
I believe Australia is maybe it might the number one immigrant group be Chinese in in Australia? I don't know, but it's
I'm not
Chinese
sure.
loom larger as
Probably
far as immigration in
we have a
California.
lot of Chinese students. That's for sure.
Yeah, coastal California does as well. The whole country does not, but coastal California does. New York City to some degree. So
Yeah, we
yeah,
have a lot of immigration in general, and fairly low key tensions. Like we don't really have too much segregation, like groups forming and antagonistic between it. We assimilate pretty good, like Canada does.
yeah. I recall hearing something about China being the Chinese government being more implicated in upgrading of Australian infrastructure, 5G, and that kind of thing, more so than the upgrading to the degree it's even happening of American infrastructure.
Right, right.
Australia might be somewhat more reliant on Chinese technocratic prowess to propel themselves forward, more so than
Right.
less at large. Yeah.
I don't actually know. Yeah, I don't know about the 5G stuff. But that was our strategy. So Keating, um, how long ago was that? Maybe 20 years ago. Our strategy was to be trading in Asia because that's our advantage. That's our position in the world, and we should open up trade with all of Asia rather than just being a colony and trading with America and the UK. That wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, that we had more ties with Asia in general.
Yeah. So Brisbane is the northernmost major city of Australia. Is that correct?
Yes, the capital of the top right state.
Top right. Yeah.
But
I
it is Brisbane is somewhat in the middle geographically.
Yeah,
If
it
you
is in the
look,
middle.
yeah.
My friend in Melbourne, he says that Brisbane is tropical. Is it actually tropical or subtropical like Miami?
Probably more like Miami. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
We've got like you don't have to go too far. You go an hour away from Brisbane and you're in rainforests.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't know if a city skyline is super indicative of just how important it is, but I was surprised by how big the Brisbane skyline was.
There's a geographic reason for that. We've got a very winding piece of river, and it's created like a peninsula kind of shape where the city is, and
Okay.
that meant that sort of forced skyrise buildings, and then also just the way it was planned. We don't have satellite areas, so it's very much concentrated in the city. So if you look at our buses and trains, if you're trying to
Yeah.
get anywhere, there's no sideways movement. You always have to go into the city and then out.
Okay. So geography has forced a sort of this dense building up and not out sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of San Francisco actually, because San Francisco is actually small population wise and area wise, but it has a striking skyline because it's just surrounded by a large bay and the ocean and so
Yep.
yeah, it's actually not a large city. San Jose, just to the south of San Francisco, is much bigger actually, but
Right.
it doesn't have that postcard look. Um,
One thing that Brisbane's done better than San Francisco is rezoned a lot of the inner suburbs to
before
be,
you even
you can
said what it was,
build.
before you even said what it was, I'm like, yeah, I bet it's better.
So we've had so much construction of high density unit dwellings in like the not inner city but just going out like about 8Ks all in that area, heaps of units being built, and it's been great. So being able to cope much better with an influx of people without real estate skyrocketing.
Yeah, yeah, because I remember thinking when I saw the Brisbane skyline, like this looks like it should be the biggest city in Australia, but we hear about Sydney all the time, and then Melbourne second most, and I hardly
Yeah,
ever hear.
it's much smaller than them. Like we're way smaller.
Yeah.
Um, we're growing quickly though. Um, yeah, we were such a small city. I remember Expo. We didn't feel like a city. It felt like more of a country town that no one knew about. And then there was Expo in 1988, and we built we turned an industrial area into like an entertainment precinct, and it kind of vitalized the city, it felt, and we turned into a little city at that moment.
Cool. Yeah, California, the U.S. is said to have a flyover country, but Australia really has a flyover country. It's just a vast swath.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to mention that movie, Picnic at Hanging Rock. Not sure if you've heard of that. It's apparently based on a true story, but it's sort of it's like a Criterion Collection film. It's like this kind of art house film, I guess I'll say art house, about a true story of like turn of the century, 1900 or so, Victorian era field trip. Some Australians went to this this big like rock in the center of the country. I guess Hanging Rock is what it is. And somehow they went missing in that area, even though surrounded by nothing. There's nowhere to hide. And this is a true story of some little girls from like a prep school or something, or boarding school, or just girls' school, who went missing around 1900 at Hanging Rock. And it became something of a stuff of legend. They turned it into a movie called Picnic at Hanging Rock. And it's kind of eerie about how these girls went missing. Anyway, it's in the middle of Australia, in the middle of nowhere. And so, yeah, that's what I think of when I think of the vast interior of Australia. I think of this place, Hanging Rock, and how sort of eerie it might be,
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's too. Say what you will about Kansas, but you can grow crops there. The center of Australia is just a shooting range for cans and BB guns. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just a huge desert of nothingness. We should be importing nuclear waste.
Yeah, but of course, I guess Australia being a wealthy Western country, just the fact that there's knowledge of that waste being anywhere, even if it's 1,000 miles away, it's just still sort of unconscionable. Like, why should Australia have to be the dumping ground? Right? That's kind of why it wouldn't happen, even if it
we've got the best spot. No earthquakes, no volcanoes, no tsunamis, no nothing. It's just inert, no population. Yeah. We can just do it.
Yeah, the U.S. has nuclear waste out in southern Nevada. Yucca Mountain, I think, is the place. So Australia is it's got like 10 Nevadas, just all of across the center. But yeah, the fact that Australians, let's say they made some concerted effort to put the world's nuclear waste there, I just don't see Australians as being a wealthy, functional country accepting being a dumping ground, even if it's nowhere near anybody. The symbolism of it all going to Australia would just be too much for the country to bear,
Depends. We've all got a price.
Right. Okay, well, I'm just going to flip through some notes I made here, see if there's anything else to cover. Oh, yeah. Now kind of the Harper's letter. I got into some beef with a friend on Twitter earlier, a guy who's here locally. Yes, we should cancel Noam Chomsky because he signed that Harper's letter with David Frum, who's this big neocon guy, So I was going to, I guess, use that as a launching point for this discussion of the politics of affiliation, which is becoming unbearable and overwhelming now, You're affiliated. I think he even put it in terms, this guy I was arguing with on Twitter, he put Chomsky, he framed the Chomsky signing that letter as being in solidarity with David Frum, the neocon. So I think he was conceptualizing it wrong. He happened to be a signatory along with David Frum. It wasn't in solidarity with an evil neocon guy.
Yeah, so, even just in pragmatic terms, when people were asked to sign the letter, I think they mentioned a few of the authors. They didn't mention everyone else.
Yeah, so I guess something I've noticed that it seems like even in leftist circles that are not particularly congenial to the cancel culture, to kind of pop progressive cancel culture, even they're playing this sort of this distressing game of who you're rubbing shoulders with even by appearing on a letter with someone, much less, going to like some kind of venue that they own in person on a stage and speaking with them. Something much less than even that is getting people into trouble. Even when like the whole reason that they're like extremely momentary, strange bedfellows is for like this principle that people generally find good.
Yep.
So I guess maybe in the Twitter era, it's becoming impossible to separate these nice sounding abstract principles from this politics of affiliation, from a personalized politics. It just, maybe there's something that sounds so, I guess, retrograde and quote unquote over with to sticking up for something like free speech, but there's so much more to be gained from just getting into the personalized politics of who signed a letter in defense of free speech. It's too much. Yeah. It's both boring and retrograde and too much work to defend liberal notions like free speech. It's much more tempting and it actually gives you new fodder day after day to go after people who signed a letter, right? See if I can explain this better. So Quillette was criticized for basically saying the same thing over and over again. Okay, yeah, free speech, and we're doing this reading history to see why we should care about free speech. Whereas the people who don't like Quillette are doing some kind of hit piece on Claire Lehman, or doing some kind of hit piece on the newest contributor to Quillette, a newer contributor like Coleman Hughes. So if you're playing that dirty game, you actually have more material every day to work with than if you're just doing this sort of somewhat tropey and trite defenses of 20th century liberal norms and free speech, blah, blah, blah. It's boring and just not very gratifying to talk principles instead of talking people, in other words,
Yeah. I'm like, I like those people defending the principles, but I see it, I've become more of a conflict theorist, to use the Slate Star Codex ideas.
Yeah.
Over time, so I do feel like it was a moral power play. It was the people they got to sign the letter, inviting them because they were high status in left-wing spaces, which is like part of the play, because here we are defending free speech in a prestigious magazine by prestigious people, and that's why I got the response that it did, because it kind of worked in that way.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, how principled is this? Because if you dig into it, most people have some line where they do think people should be cancelled.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point. The people who are saying, so you see a lot of the pro Harper's letter people are saying things like, sarcastically, oh, how can anyone be against this? Oh, the shock and the horror. Oh, they're getting they're pushing back on something so harmless as free speech. That's very disingenuous, because the whole point of getting these people to sign on to this is to pull in this personalized politics, this sort of power game, where you're sticking up for free speech using specific people. So taking on these specific people who signed it, and then acting like, it's some sort of this beyond the pale thing. How could you possibly be against free speech by, getting on these people's cases who signed on to that letter? That's disingenuous, because you brought them into it because you were expecting to kind of you were expecting that reaction, is a long-winded way of saying. So it's disingenuous to then balk at that reaction.
Yeah, it's more like, I don't think they were being cynical doing the letter, though. I think they want people to be worried about this culture, and you can call it cancel culture. We can call it, SJWs, or you can call it wokeness, or whatever. And it all points to a similar thing. And more people are getting worried about it, but then there's more people joining it too. I think they're winning at this point. Like, they seem to be going from strength to strength.
The anti-Harper's letter or the pro-Harper's letter?
The just general wokeness.
Yeah.
It's a kind of religion that's becoming very powerful.
One thing that makes the Harper's letter people are on the wrong side of history, and one thing that illustrates that to me is the fact that they definitely skew way older than the anti-Harper's letter. You saw that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hosted at Substack, the anti-Harpers. And those people, I don't know their ages, it's true, but the few of them that I do know of are younger than the likes of Chomsky or Pinker. So Matt Iglesias would be someone who's on the younger side, who is the pro-Harpers. But it definitely seems to skew older and more established, the people who are sticking up for free speech. Whereas the younger people, the younger people are the one who are rebutting it. So that can't possibly bode well for where things are going, There's a dearth of young people signing on with these older people. Matt Iglesias would be sort of an example of younger people, but he's kind of an exception to the rule, and he's also a little bit established himself, really. So.
Yeah, I think it skews young, for sure.
Yeah. But thanks for talking with me, Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, we move in the same circles. We even have our Twitter profile. We're both wearing the mask, the white mask, a white mask at that. So anyway, yeah, cool, man. I'll get back to you when this has been cleaned up, and I think what I'm going to do is just put it on. It's just going to be audio, but there will be a visual component, but it won't be our faces. I think I'm going to put it up on YouTube and have like somewhat of a slideshow maybe playing that tandem with the talking points that are raised, right? So there'll be a picture of the Harper's letter when we're talking about the Harper's letter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll work on this and we'll touch base again later.
Yeah, if you want to do something similar and maybe like have some topics that we get into deeper, like.
I'm gonna send you an article that another thing we didn't talk about that we could have, that talks about the sort of techno-commercial infrastructure that is succumbing, that is pulling us all into it. That is sort of a background condition that could explain the wokeness as well. Essentially, yeah, Twitter is so much more immediate than the print culture. There's a certain print culture of the 20th century that gave rise to free speech that was being undermined by social media now, which is wedding ideas to people and their ugly faces so much more than was the case in 20th century. So that's part of why we can't. It's getting harder to disaggregate like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Idea from people. Anyway, all right, Mark. I'll let you go. You have a good Monday.
All right.
And, cool.
Talk later.